Hello and good evening. I'm hoping this is now working. Thank you to those who have bared with us while we're a little late starting. It doesn't matter how many times you rehearse these things. Something complicated always comes up at the last minute, but here we are. So thank you very much. My name's Anna Wood. I'm a trustee of GBSN and I'm a mum to JJ, who's 5, and Cooper, who is 2. So this event has had an extraordinary reach. And so I know there's a lot of people, I think there may be a lot of people watching who don't know a lot about GBSN. So although you've kindly waited while we deal with a technical issue, and I hope you'll spare me a couple of minutes just to tell you a little bit about GBSN. We are Gloucestershire Breastfeeding Supporters Network. We are a small self-funded charity operating to offer judgment-free breastfeeding support to parents and parents-to-be in Gloucestershire. We operate on a face-to-face model. And in our group setting, we always have a BFC breastfeeding counsellor present, as well as our trained team of peer supporters. Currently, in this COVID world, we are running 6 weekly outdoor breastfeeding support groups, and we're still offering free virtual one-to-one appointments with our team of NCT trained breastfeeding counsellors. We exist to help mums at every stage of their breastfeeding journey, and we support them to achieve their own personal breastfeeding goals. Tonight is personally a really important event for me. I first came to GBSN as a failed, in my own words, failed breastfeeding mum. I now realise that I was experiencing breastfeeding grief. GBSN helped me to process that breastfeeding grief and to realise that I wasn't a failure, and helped me realise that help me to realise that I could have a better journey the second time round. Thanks to GBSN, I did. I'm so sorry. I'm just receiving a load of messages saying something's going wrong, so I don't even know if this is working or not. I'm so sorry. Oh, right, now, sorry, now I'm being told I can be seen. I can't see myself. Sorry, this is going so smoothly. I can't wait to hand over to Amy and she can just get on with the important stuff. So anyway, so basically GBSN helped me personally to realise that I wasn't a failure, and they've helped me to put my own breastfeeding grief to one side and have a successful breastfeeding journey second time round, meeting and exceeding my personal goals. So I was delighted, therefore, to be invited to become a trustee of GBSN just over 2 years ago. And I love having the opportunity to work towards a future perfect where no mum experiences breastfeeding grief. Which brings me neatly on to Amy, who is waiting patiently, having sat through various technical bits this evening. I'm going to describe Amy in the words from her own website, because then it's a reputable source. So Amy, as many of you will know, is a professor of maternal and child public health at Swansea University, based in the Department of Public Health, Policy and Social Sciences. She is director of their research centre LIFT, which stands for Lactation, Infant Feeding and Translation. And she also leads the university's MSc in Child Public Health. She researches everything to do with becoming a new parent, with a particular focus on infant feeding, mental health and normal baby behaviour. As well as a number of academic papers, Amy has published 5 books: Informed is Best, Breastfeeding Uncovered, I've missed one, Positive Breastfeeding Book, her latest book, which is available now on her website, called Let's Talk About the First Year of Parenting, and the book that is key to tonight, which is Why Breastfeed, no, the lighting won't be my friend here, but Why Breastfeeding Grief and Trauma Matter. And when she set out to write this book, Amy invited mums to send their stories, and she received 2,000, and she spent 2 years reading those stories before she even started writing this amazing book. So before I hand over to Amy, I just want to quote a couple of lines, which in my copy of the book are highlighted. Which is, in the UK, almost half of women who start out breastfeeding have stopped by 6 weeks, with as many as 90% of them reporting they weren't ready to do so. Women are left dealing, and then the second one is, women are left dealing with the loss of breastfeeding and anger that they were not supported. And we, as a society, seem surprised that they are depressed. And I'm sure that everybody watching here today has either had a sad experience themselves or exist to support women to try and have better experiences, and maybe both. So finally, I must emphasise that Amy, who is giving her time to sit and listen to me at the moment, but she's very kindly given her time in preparing for and talking to us tonight for free. We hugely value Amy's expertise, and I really hope that when I contacted Amy initially, it was clear that we were perfectly willing to pay for her time, but she's just that kind. And in turn, GBSN is a self-funded charity, and whilst tonight might not be costing us anything, running a charity like GBSN does cost us money. So during tonight's Facebook Live, we're occasionally going to pop up on screen, firstly, a little reminder that you can buy Amy's books direct from her own website, and secondly, that you can text to donate to give £3, or you can change the number to give an amount of your choice to help GBSN keep supporting other mums. And finally, if you've got any questions during this talk, please type them into the comments bit that comes up, and I'm going to put a selection of questions to Amy at the end after the main part of her talk concludes. And so finally, 15 minutes into the live, for which I thank you all for your patience, I'm going to bring Amy up onto the screen. She's got a 3-second warning. Here she comes. And here is Professor Amy Brown.
Who's a bit confused by her webcam being so close.
The super zoomed in Amy Brown, which is just how we want you. So fabulous. Well, that being well, I'm going to hide myself and leave you all listening to the expert.
When's the expert turning up then, Anna? Thank you for that. I think when we use the word talk, it sounds slightly more formal than what I'm going to do this evening. And really what I'm going to do is talk about this huge issue that we have around breastfeeding grief and trauma. It's slightly strange talking to myself because I can just see a kind of screen of myself talking. So having a conversation with myself this evening, by the looks of things, I can see comments now. That's far more reassuring. So kind of going back to the beginning, all of this, this whole thing started in the very academic way of having an argument on Twitter. And it was kind of like the penultimate kind of argument of arguments that had been going on for so long. The first thing that kind of triggered all of this was I was having yet another conversation on Twitter around this whole topic of how women feel when they can't breastfeed for as long as they want to. And as usual, it was getting all taken down different roads, and people were saying, oh, you're putting pressure on women, oh, you're making them feel guilty, oh, you're suggesting that they're not a good enough mother. And I was just saying again to them, no, it's not about that. It's about how women who wanted to breastfeed, and that's a really important part in all of this, women who wanted to breastfeed, how they then feel when they can't do it for as long as they wanted. And this conversation went on for a while. And I wrote a comment as I kind of was leaving the conversation. I said, look, it's almost these women, they're showing signs of trauma. I would go as far as to say they are traumatized by their experiences. And literally about 2 minutes later, this guy popped up who I'd never seen before in my life. Everybody's commenting on my bookcase now. Yeah. Look, it's tidy. Oh, hang on, look. This guy popped up and he said to me, you cannot use the word trauma when it comes to breastfeeding and women. And I'm like, hello, who are you? Who have you done like huge amounts of research in this subject? And it turned out he knew nothing about breastfeeding, or I think women in general. But it got me thinking. It had been almost a casual comment, but it got me thinking the way women feel sometimes when they can't breastfeed and what they go through until that point really is showing signs of clinical trauma. So before all of this had happened, I'd spent several months, I think even years at this point, having this ongoing argument around the phrase fed is best. Now, I will openly say, if someone says fed is best to you and it makes you feel better about your whole feeding experience, then brilliant. That's what we want, anything that works. But I was seeing this just increasing amount of women who'd wanted to breastfeed their baby, couldn't, and people around them were going, look, fed is best. The main thing is that your baby's fed. That's all we have to worry about. That's the bottom line. Feed your baby. You don't have to worry about anything else. And for a start, it kind of reminded me of the all that matters is a healthy baby comment. You know, a woman's had a very traumatic birth and she's told, look, what are you worrying about? Why look at your baby, they're fine. Why are you feeling all these emotions? But it kept coming, and women just kept saying to me, I feel like I'm being completely dismissed in all of this. People are suggesting, even if it's meant with absolute kindness, that my feeding experience didn't matter, that what I wanted to do didn't matter. So fast forward again to that conversation with that guy on Twitter, I thought, okay, we need to actually do something about this. And what I can do from an academic perspective is start researching women's experiences, particularly around how they feel if they haven't been able to breastfeed. And up until this point, I've been researching infant feeding probably about 10 years by this point. I'd mainly been looking at barriers to breastfeeding, what was stopping women from being able to breastfeed, but hadn't ever really looked properly at how they feel. So it was thinking kind of about that. And what I did is put together some research, just saying to women, oh, okay, if you hadn't been able to breastfeed your baby for as long as you wanted to, and you have any sort of negative emotion about that, talk to me, fill in my survey. And we'd got ethics permission, we'd gone through everything, and I put together this questionnaire. It had open-ended boxes in it, about 12 of them, asking women all these details about how they felt. Put it up on social media, expecting maybe a few hundred responses. I actually got around 3,000 in a week. I've never been so stunned by data collection in my life. It was just this complete outpouring of grief and anger and just devastation into this survey. Looking at the responses, I actually found that some women were actually carrying on breastfeeding still, but just not how they wanted to be. But when I looked at those who had to stop before they were ready, there were a good 2,000 women there, all of whom were writing these really, really lengthy answers. I don't think hardly anyone just wrote, oh yeah, feel a bit sad about it, to be honest. Wish I could have done it for longer. That wasn't great, was it? It were these long, long stories. So I felt I had to sit there, and I read absolutely every single one of them, which is why it took 2 years. And as you can imagine, the actual process of doing that is quite distressing. You read one woman's story and you see how she's been let down, and you read another and another and another. And what was so distressing to me in reading those was that a lot of the time I could see from the woman's perspective that if she'd have got different support, and by support I mean a broad range of things, then her feeding experience could have been very different. So I could see that, but I could also see time and time again that women were describing these stories about them really wanting to breastfeed, them doing their absolute best, being failed by systems around them, stopping breastfeeding, and then completely blaming themselves. And they couldn't seem to see that it wasn't their fault, that it was everybody else's fault around them. It was the system that they'd given birth in. It was the society that they were trying to breastfeed in. It wasn't them. It wasn't that they suddenly decided one day, oh, I can't be bothered with this, it's a bit boring, I'm not going to do this, and then feel terrible about it. So I was going to write up, and it is still on my to-do list, and I have 2 open Word documents, which I'm very slowly doing, academic papers on this subject, which I must really write. But as I was writing those, it just didn't feel like the best possible use of my time to write it all into about 5,000 words and stick it in an academic journal. Yes, it's important to publish, and yes, we'll get around to it. But what I wanted to do was get the book out there just to tell women's stories, just so everyone else can read it and go, wow, this is how I felt too. And one of the biggest things that I get from the book is that when women read it, they often go from a state of going, oh, I didn't realize I actually could kind of articulate how I felt, or I didn't realize that so many other women felt this way as well. I quite regularly have emails from women going, you're writing about me, how do you know my story? And it's because we know what the pattern is, we can see it. Knowing breastfeeding, knowing the lack of support that a lot of women face, and knowing how important it is to women, then of course we can see it, and it is there, and it is there. So where to start with all of this? When I started writing the book, I wanted to put as many women's stories into it as possible. But one of the first places I started was actually considering in all of this why breastfeeding was so important to women. One of my issues with the fed is best message, or women being told, oh, look, you've breastfed for long enough now, your baby will be fine, is that quite possibly from a health perspective, their baby may well be fine. How we feed babies, we know on a population level is linked to their health, but we don't know what it's like for any individual baby. We know that there are plenty of babies out there who have been formula fed and are technically fine. We know that this isn't a life sentence, an automatic, if you stop breastfeeding, your baby's going to suddenly become really sick. But when you talk to women, you say, so why is breastfeeding important to you? And it feels like sometimes they have to give the automatic answer that, oh, it's important because it's for my baby's health. And yes, that's really important. And for some babies, it will be even more important than others. But actually, when you start digging under the surface, there are so many other reasons why it matters to women too. It's not just about the health of their baby. It's about their own health. It's about their own mental health. It's about how they feel. We know that if you look at research around mental health and breastfeeding, that when breastfeeding is going well, women's mental health can be really protected. So there are lots of reasons for it. There's a psychological aspect that you're doing what you wanted to do, you're achieving what you're achieving, you're caring for your baby in the way you wanted to care for them. But physiologically, your body and your mental health is also being protected. So when women are breastfeeding, their oxytocin levels are higher. So oxytocin is the hormone of calmness and love and cuddliness and relaxation. Their prolactin levels when they're breastfeeding. Prolactin helps calm, it helps get women back to sleep. And there's fascinating research. Kathy Kendall-Tackett has written a whole paper on it, looking at how breastfeeding actually helps women deal with stress. Now, stress can mean all sorts of things, but stress can mean things like physical stress on your body. So not sleeping well, not eating well, being very run down, which we know a lot of new parents are. She's shown that when women are breastfeeding, the impact of that stress on their body doesn't seem to be so strong. So when we get very physically stressed, we get a lot of inflammation in our body, and inflammation has been linked to all sorts of different illnesses and disorders. But breastfeeding women seem to have lower levels of inflammation compared to women who aren't breastfeeding. So it's like breastfeeding is physiologically protecting the body. So there's all that side of the thing. So it's calming them, it's making them feel more relaxed. Research actually shows that breastfeeding mothers actually get more sleep. When you look at it in close detail, it might not feel like it, but we know that if your baby is close to you at night, you can simply kind of roll over, feed them, they go straight back to sleep again. It's a different process to having to get up and make a bottle. So that's one of the reasons why it helps keep you more rested, at least. So when a woman then has to stop breastfeeding, she also gets hit with all that physical side of things. She loses that tool of feeding her baby in the night. She has to get up. The hormones are disrupted, the hormones return to a pre-pregnant state, and we know it affects women physically that way. But it's about wider than that again. To me, one of the really important points in how women are treated when they haven't been able to breastfeed is the fact that there don't seem to be any tests or procedures. It seems completely normal for a woman to experience things that mean she doesn't make enough milk. And whether that's through an illness or a disorder that's always caused that, or whether that's through her experiences. We just take that woman who's at the stage where she's not making enough milk. What happens to her? Mostly she'll be told by health professionals, oh, right, you've done it long enough. Oh, some women can't breastfeed. Just use a bottle instead. There's nothing that can be done. And it's a complete dead end. To me, I want to know why there are not tests. Why is there not a diagnosis? Why are there not tests that are automatically done when a part of a woman's body isn't working properly? And it fits into that whole body of evidence that we have of women's health not being prioritised and not being invested in and not being researched at the same rate as men's health is. And it's leading women just to have this completely abrupt end to their journey, because they're not able to feed, they're really upset at not being able to breastfeed, but then it's that double whammy of kind of never getting an answer to that. They can't say, I was diagnosed with this is why I couldn't. They haven't got the explanation for it. And that really, really gets to them as well. coming at it from a different perspective of a way of caring for your baby. Now, I never ever want this to be mixed up with the idea that you can't bond with your baby if you're not breastfeeding them. But breastfeeding is a very specific way of bonding. It's a very specific way of caring for a baby. It's about mothering, it's about nurturing, it's about calming them and soothing them, rather than it just simply being about getting milk in the baby. And a lot of the time, women have said to me, yeah, formula fixed my baby's feeding problem. So formula fed the baby, but it didn't solve everything else alongside it. When I had to stop breastfeeding, I lost that mothering experience, that ability to feed my baby back to sleep at night, the ability to calm them when they're upset, the ability to connect with them in that way, the ability to give them a quick feed for comfort when they woke up at night. All of that went, that way of mothering, that way of connecting. So if you put all of that together, is it really any wonder that when women have to stop breastfeeding before they're ready, then they can feel absolutely dreadful about it? We did some other research, a few years ago now, actually looking at women's breastfeeding experiences and their risk of postnatal depression. And one of the really important things in that was the concept of readiness to stop feeding. And what we found is that when women stop breastfeeding, if their baby was 2 weeks old, but they were really happy to stop feeding, or they just weren't bothered, they were ready to do so, it was fine, then they were fine. Their mental health was fine. If they had to stop breastfeeding before they were ready, they were at a greater risk of postnatal depression. If their baby was 1 week old, 1 month old, 1 year old, 2-year-old, it didn't matter how old that baby was. It was the fact that it was being taken away from them. Their way of caring for that baby, feeding that baby, their identity, the fact that they had to stop and their body wasn't working the way they expected to, all of that had a devastating impact on them. So coming back to the research, one of the key questions I actually asked women, how did you feel when you weren't able to breastfeed your baby for as long as you could, as long as you wanted to? I kind of expected it to be things like, I'd feel sad, I'm angry at the system, just kind of general emotions like that. But the sheer scale and complexity of the emotions that came back to me, yes, things like sadness and anger were there, but it was also about grief. It was about feeling robbed, feeling angry at their body, feeling even angry at their baby, feeling that they'd just been let down, feeling shocked. One of the big things that they never expected not to be able to feed. Often they came from generations or countries or cultures where breastfeeding was the absolute norm. And then they were in the UK and suddenly the system failed them and it all fell apart. And it was how that then all affected them. Looking at questions around who they blamed, some could see that it was the system that had let them down, but the vast majority were saying, I feel awful and I think it's my fault. So they were blaming themselves internally and carrying that around with them without being able to say, no, okay, I didn't get the support there or there or there. One of the saddest things in the whole project was the women who said, and there were quite a few of them that said, I blame my baby for all of this, that I blame my baby for not being able to breastfeed, for taking this away from us. And of course, they then felt absolutely terrible on top of that. They were all saying, I blame my baby and I hate myself because of all of this. So it's just that complexity of it all. Looking kind of this concept then of actually whether these women could be considered traumatized or not, what I did with all the stories was read through them and see whether they were meeting in their stories clinical definitions of trauma. Now, if you look at any diagnostic tool for trauma, take, for example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is basically this huge book of every single psychological disorder you could ever want to label yourself with. We're always told as psychology students of first year, do not read this, do not go through kind of trying to diagnose yourself because the temptation to do it is there. But it's this idea that to be traumatized and to be considered to have post-traumatic stress disorder, you either have had to be in the situation where you almost died, or you suffered serious injury, or you saw someone else suffer serious injury or almost die. And when I first started looking at this, I thought, oh, right, okay, no, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here with trauma. Maybe it's not that. But when you kind of step back and think about what some of these women have been through, then quite often they have something in their feeding history that would fit into that category. So they have a baby who has been separated in neonatal care from them, and they were worried about that baby. They have babies who have lost 10% or more of their body weight and nobody was doing anything, and they were worried their baby was going to die. They had such nipple trauma or abscesses or any as a physiological issue that I would argue that that was a serious traumatic injury. But there's also the wider sense of loss. Now, more modern and community definitions of trauma very much consist of the experience of being traumatized by something, being affected so strongly by something that you have these really long-lasting, difficult memories. And certainly when you start looking at those definitions of trauma, it's spot on for what people are experiencing. There's also more of a kind of evolutionary argument that from a physiological perspective, going back, remembering, where we've evolved from, that if a baby had been born, the body would expect it to be breastfed. So on a subconscious level, if the baby is not being breastfed, what does the subconscious body think has happened to that baby? That they've been injured, that they're unable to feed, that they've died? Is there some kind of deeper subconscious trauma going on there? So looking then at the kind of next symptoms that women would experience, or anyone would experience if they were going trauma, I'm going to see if I can read these through because I am going to forget them. They are here somewhere. So the symptoms of being traumatized then, they include things like intrusion symptoms. Now, intrusion symptoms are essentially symptoms that you don't control. So you have thoughts and feelings that come at you. I mean, we have things like that every day about normal things, but if you're having memories of things, difficult emotions that are sort of happening to you and are coming out of nowhere, that's an example of an intrusion symptom. And just to give an example from a quote from one of the mothers, I have a regular dream when I'm back in hospital and trying to get support for my dehydrated baby, and I can't. It goes on and on where I'm begging for help, but no one can hear me. And each time I fail to get my baby, fail to get help, my baby shrinks a little more. I always wake up just before he disappears, dripping in sweat and my heart pounding. And you can feel it. You can see that woman and her experience in hospital. And how dare anybody ever tell her that she hasn't been traumatized by that experience? The second symptom is avoidance. So avoiding things that remind you of the traumatic memory. So it would be things like avoiding people, avoiding situations, avoiding memories of it. Now, that's really pretty difficult when you've got a baby and the thing you're trying to avoid is breastfeeding, because everybody around you either asks you about breastfeeding or tells you, about their breastfeeding experience, or maybe is breastfeeding a baby themselves. And of course, it has a devastating impact then on friendships and socializing and where people can go. Just an example here, I do everything I can to avoid one friend who is a real lactivist. She's lovely and would hate to know she hurts me, but I can't bear to hear her talk about her struggles breastfeeding her 2-year-old. And it's just the idea. The other thing is, a woman told me about how she couldn't go down the baby aisle in a supermarket because it just reminded her of trying to feed and having to buy formula and the whole trauma around it. Third one is negative alterations in cognition and mood. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying you have negative emotions. And women really talked about the strength of how they felt here. So it's things like, how do I feel? Everything. I'm angry, sad, and guilty all at once. I hate myself. I think I'm not a good enough mother. Nothing anyone says or does can change the fact I failed. And I despise the GP who failed to diagnose my son's tongue tie. I really think it's all his fault and there should be consequences. I reported him, but nothing has been done. Why is it fair I feel this way and he feels nothing? And again, it's just the strength of it. It's the hatred, it's the hating themselves, it's hating other people, it's the anger, it's the guilt, it's everything at once. And it's at the same time, people are telling women it doesn't matter. All that matters is your baby is fed. So one of the really key features of trauma is being dismissed. So when talking about birth trauma in her book on birth trauma, Emma Sandberg, the psychologist, talks about the idea that, say you were in a car crash and you were taken to hospital, and everyone keeps telling you you're absolutely fine, even though both legs are broken. And all they keep doing is asking about your car. How's your car? Is your car written off? Oh, your car's all right, is it? Well, that's the main thing that matters. I mean, it's a slightly different example to go from a car to a baby, but it's the underlying thing that people are just saying, it doesn't matter. Your baby's fed. Why are you worrying about this? It's a dismissal of it all. Alterations in arousal and reactivity. So it's basically being on edge, being very alert to situations. So being really kind of worried that someone's going to remind you of your experience. And just avoidance again with this one. So here, I do everything I can to avoid breastfeeding to the point of excluding potentially great new friendships. I even do things like scan their social media to see if they post breastfeeding articles or belong to groups. And if they do, I hide them from my wall. So it's affecting friendships. It's affecting women's ability to go out and socialize with other mothers and connections who they may have so much in common with, but it's that breastfeeding barrier. One of the other criteria for trauma is considering how long the symptoms have been lasting. So diagnostically, it's meant to last for a month, at least a month until you're considered traumatized. When I collected the data, I didn't put any length on how old the baby could be. And I fully expected there to be women there with perhaps 2 or 3 year olds who they were still really struggling with how they felt. The oldest baby somebody wrote about was 36 years old. And it was just so stark of how long this can last for. I should have known it was coming, because literally wherever I go, as soon as somebody hears what I do, they either start telling me their breastfeeding story, or a lot of the time what I get is an awkward, but I couldn't breastfeed, as if I'm going to kind of, slap them and walk off because they didn't breastfeed their baby. And it's always when I start talking to them about that, the strength of the memory, it's still with them. And I always remember talking to this woman. I'd met her at a study day or a conference or something, and I can't remember where now. And she told me how, just the emotions of how she felt and the guilt and the grief she felt about not being able to breastfeed was still with her. And she could still remember the experience of not being able to do it. Her baby had just retired. He was literally off playing golf. He was in his 60s. And she is left there still grieving, still affected by it, because everybody had just kind of stopped talking to her about it. But back when he was little, they just said, look, it doesn't matter, give formula, it's fine. Because again, this idea that it's just about the milk. And I think this is one of the big issues when you see so much animosity in some online groups, particularly on Twitter, is that people seem to think that if we say breastfeeding matters or breastfeeding grief matters, that we're attacking women who haven't been able to breastfeed and feel guilty about that. We're never, ever doing that. It's if a woman is happy formula feeding, amazing. We are so happy that they feel good about that, and they just feel fine. They feel no emotion about it. Great. It's about trying to prevent this happening for another generation of women again. Because at the moment, when you have these so-called mummy wars going on and women fighting with each other about whether they're being made to feel guilty or not, they're spending their time attacking each other, which the government probably really like, because we're not then spending that time doing stuff that would actually force a change. So the next generation of women do get the support that they need. And women who feel this way do get the psychological support that they need, or just simply the recognition that it's been awful and that they've been left down. So again, it's about just recognizing how women feel. It's never about judging the milk. It's about what those women personally feel that they have lost. And if women don't feel they've lost anything, if they're quite happy moving to formula milk, then great. But for so many women, when you say to them, fed is best, or look, he's fine, or just give a bottle, it doesn't matter, it just dismisses all the experiences that they've had, and it dismisses how they're still feeling. Just one of the last criteria. Would you say that trauma and your experiences are interfering with your life? And this was a big one. So two here, I try to avoid seeing friends who are particularly breastfeeding happy. I know it's not healthy to do this, but it stops me getting upset and should only last a while. I think they know what I'm doing, but they understand, although it doesn't seem to stop them talking about how wonderful they find breastfeeding. And a worrying one, I'm a midwife, I'm dreading returning to work, as how am I meant to support new mothers now? And where is the care and support for supporting women who have had a baby, have been feeding that baby, in returning to roles where they're supporting breastfeeding? Where is the care, the unpacking of that, the looking about whether they need more expert support or not, or whether they just need to talk to somebody about what happened? Where is the support for them in that context? One of the other things that really struck me from this research was that so many women were saying that they had sort of double impact of grief and being traumatized by their experience. The first one was through not being able to breastfeed. So they lost that. They lost their experience. They were coming to terms with that. The second one was how they were treated when that happened. And I think for some women, it was almost that their experience of stopping breastfeeding was almost worse for them than not being able to breastfeed. One of the things they talked about was this kind of black hole of support, that there was no support for them to stop. There was no one saying, right, let's talk about how you feel. Right, let's support you to mix feed. Right, let's support you to make a bottle safely. Let's try and get you giving a little bit of breast milk for as long as possible. All right, you want to stop, let's talk you through that. There was no psychological support for any of that. One woman even talked about the fact that she had I think the baby was about 6 weeks old, and there was a medical reason why she had to stop breastfeeding them. And she'd spent the first 6 weeks breastfeeding really well. She'd made brilliant friends in this breastfeeding support group, and she was literally told that she had to leave because she was no longer going to be breastfeeding. So it was the trauma of being kicked out, the trauma of being othered, and just like, you're not one of us anymore, you can't come. And, you know, the nonsense of all of that, what was the idea that everyone in the breastfeeding group was suddenly going to stop breastfeeding and run around kind of giving formula because one woman had stopped? No, they would have understood how she felt. They would have known how to comfort her because they understood. So it's that whole concept that we need to work out more publicized ways of talking about all of this, but where women can go for support, so who they can go to. Very few women actually realize that you can go to a breastfeeding support network. You can ring the National Breastfeeding Helpline. You can talk to an IBCLC about stopping breastfeeding, about how you feel about that, just as much as you can about continuing breastfeeding. But there's no kind of recognition necessarily amongst people about that. People think they have to be on their own. They also think that they shouldn't talk about it because everybody around them is invalidating their emotions. So I think sort of the biggest message from all of this is that you're not alone. If you're feeling any of this, then there are so many women. I mean, if I found 2,000 of them in a week from a few social media posts, then there are many, many, many women feeling this way. Your emotions should not be ignored. They are completely valid. They are a completely normal reaction to losing something that you wanted. You'll have a whole load of hormones on top of all of that going through the change of stopping breastfeeding anyway, but those memories that they last for a very long time. There are people out there, the breastfeeding support services, breastfeeding groups. Talk to somebody. If you think you need stronger help, stronger is want of a better word, isn't it? More professional help, then look for a counsellor who has experience in supporting women through this. There are so many good people there that you can go and talk to. Find someone who's got perinatal counselling experience or psychologist experience, and they will be able to support you through it. There are psychological techniques that can be used for this. You can move to a place where it's not getting at you every single day. So I think I'll stop there and leave some chance for some questions. Anna's coming back. It's just taking that, talk to somebody. Don't suffer through this on your own. Know that it's so common, and we've got to talk about it just more openly generally. I think that's one thing that people say to me after reading the book, that they suddenly realise that there are other people out there and that talking about it is a positive thing.
Amy, thank you so much. The comments have been flying, and you've clearly struck a chord with everybody that's watching, all nearly 200 people that have been watching this. So I very much feel it was worth us persevering through those quite technical glitches at the beginning and a very 15 minutes.
I don't know what's going on here with this lighting, but.
And for those watching as well, Amy and I have realised that the streaming service we're using, when we're on screen, it's not a mirror, so I cannot understand that thing you can see is not my left hand. And honestly, I am a woman who also struggled to remember which boob to use next, so frankly left and right was always a struggle. I was very much the hairband lady. So there's a few questions that, and I'd also like to thank quickly my fellow Facebook page admins, the GBSN volunteers, who have been batting off spammers and answering questions and providing links to people all the way through. So thank you so much. Quickly, before I go into the specific questions on this talk, I'd also just like to say, somebody has said, oh, can we access these GBSN online services even if we live abroad? Our funding is for Gloucestershire, but at the moment we are virtual, and we have genuinely supported women, as it happens, British women, but living in Dubai, I want to say it was Norway, in Belgium. So we certainly go out of county at the moment, although we are a Gloucestershire charity at the moment in this COVID situation. And it's something we're hoping we can go on with in future if the funding is going to be there. Also, I would say this, if I don't muck it up entirely, this will be available to view afterwards. And there's so many comments coming through, so people can take the time, although we will turn commenting off at the end of the live. So, Amy, a few of the questions that I've picked out were you touched on the fact that what these triggers are for legitimising the trauma, and how we demonstrate to a healthcare professional, actually, I am experiencing a trauma. It struck me that a woman suffering breastfeeding grief could go to her GP and just flat out lie and over exaggerate what the problems are to try and be taken seriously. And I think so often perhaps women generally feel forced to exaggerate the situation. But what advice would you or thoughts do you have on how on earth we actually hit that trigger to say, yeah, I legitimately am traumatized, and how should we help women get that support, not only from breastfeeding groups but from healthcare professionals?
I think we've got such a long way to go at the moment, and we have a issue in general sometimes with the medical profession not being particularly trained around breastfeeding as it is. So them really often struggling. It's about finding someone trusted, maybe, to get that way in first. Mm. So why I always suggest ringing someone like the National Breastfeeding Helpline, talking to a breastfeeding support group, so that you've started the conversation. Perhaps writing down how you feel. I've got, if you haven't got the book, there are quite a few articles I've written that are short, obviously on grief and trauma, maybe taking one of those along with you. Getting the support.
Turn up at the GP surgery and say, read this, help me. Yes, they should.
In all seriousness, talking about how you feel, perhaps in kind of broader terms, it would fit as well with how people feel with postnatal depression, it's probably easier to get a counselling access through postnatal depression than it is for this at the moment. It's about trying and hoping that if you describe the symptoms and how you're feeling and just the general area of perinatal mental health, then you should be able to get support. Other people have looked privately. I know that's a more expensive option, but there are some very good perinatal psychologists who can see you far quicker. The issue that we have with counselling at the moment through GP practices is often a very, very long waiting list.
Even with the priority for a mother of a baby under 1.
Yeah, they're still often very, very long. So it's about trying all avenues, I guess. A good, the breastfeeding counsellors, IBCLC, will have the skills to help you through this. Often it's about taking that step just to talk in the first place, and then you can take it further. So if you get your thoughts straight with somebody, then you can take that to the GP. Take someone with you who understands how you feel, and just don't let them dismiss you. It is a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen so many people here that you've, an anonymous message saying it's like she can read my mind, because what you're talking about is what they're feeling, and certainly what you said about going, well, I know the baby's okay, I'm a mother, of course I've prioritised my baby, but what about me? And that feeling doesn't go away. Another question we had in is, as a health professional working on a paediatric intensive care ward where we do have mothers expressing and feeding their babies, any top tips for how we can best support mothers in such a difficult environment? You said talking about practical tips and language to use. Yes,
that is a huge topic that we could talk about all evening. Thankfully, you can go and have a look at Lindsay Hookway's website. If you put Lindsay Hookway into Facebook, you will find her. She is actually doing a PhD with me, actually on this very subject about how paediatric wards can better support breastfeeding mothers.
Fantastic.
So he's written some articles on that, just kind of broadly there. It's around the general practice of just supporting breastfeeding, supporting it as normal, supporting the idea that mother and baby have to stay together, and seeing breast milk and breastfeeding as not just about food, it's about that. It's almost a medical treatment, isn't it? It's probably the wrong word to use for it, but the importance and comfort. And often when things like breast milk will stay down and food won't, just seeing the importance of it, keeping mum and baby together would probably cover it lot on a very simple level. But go and have a look at Lindsay. If anyone can link to Lindsay in the chat, that would be great.
That's brilliant. Lindsay's done talks for us in the past, actually, in person. Remember those days? But more on her amazing work about sleep and helping breastfeeding mums to sort of have a more realistic and comfortable experience with their sleep in the breastfed baby. Hopefully some links will come up. People are certainly typing the name in to help people with their Googling.
Or to try and conjure her from the in-depth of the internet, we tag her enough.
Are you there, Lindsay? Are you watching? I've heard this several breastfeeding celebs. I know there's apparently. I was receiving some messages from Elizabeth Mayo, our chair of trustees, going, "Oh, so-and-so's watching," because it's really exciting. I mean, obviously, it's you that's attracted this, Amy, which is amazing. I'm going to mention healthcare professionals again. How can we support healthcare professionals who themselves have experienced breastfeeding grief but are trying to support women to breastfeed, because that's going to be the worst situation when you're having to say to people, no, it can work, but at home going, but my journey didn't. How can we?
I mean, again, it's a huge, it's just a huge gap. I think it's being recognised maybe a little bit more, probably not perfectly, in terms of birth trauma and midwife going back.
Yes.
The breastfeeding trauma just isn't noticed.
No.
And again, it's finding someone to talk to and just talking through how you feel and being able to kind of process it all, and being able to sit with that and know that by supporting the woman in front of you, you're helping change things. I think we've unfortunately seen in the past in some, and obviously not all at all, but there have been some cases, where health professionals haven't been able to, and they're so traumatized by that, then they want to save other women from that trauma, so they drink a bottle feed. If you see what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I really wish I knew the answers to all of this. Well, I know what the answer is. It's talking, it's counselling, it's processing all of this. The issue with it is getting that recognised. So anybody working in a breastfeeding support position, IBCLC, in any kind of medical or healthcare position who has the power to actually do something about this, it is almost a call to action that we need this recognised as something that's on offer to all health professionals going back to work.
Yes, absolutely.
And for men as well, in terms of their partners having difficult experiences, and them often then having that wanting to protect her, wanting to protect others. It all gets so complicated because
it does. I know for my partner throughout my second pregnancy, I know he was just thinking, oh my God, what if it happens again? How am I going to get her through breastfeeding grief a second? If she can't breastfeed this one, she'll never come back from it. And I am so glad that's a bridge we never had to learn how to cross, thanks to getting the right support. And another question that has come up, a tricky one is, what if you know a woman, or you're speaking to a woman who is showing all the signs of breastfeeding grief, but yet it won't really acknowledge that the breastfeeding didn't work out as she wanted, and she's perhaps in that denial phase. And a few people have been saying, denial of breastfeeding grief is a real thing. And I wonder whether there's a way to support somebody like that, or do you just back off and leave them to it because you don't want to force on, because you wouldn't want to, but you didn't achieve what you wanted to, did you? Because you wouldn't want to make them feel bad, but if you can tell that's what they're thinking.
I think a lot of what we see, a lot of the arguments we see online are all down to that. The stages of grief model, the denial, the anger, I can never remember which way around they go, but they completely apply here. In that, you do see some people who are so traumatized by it that they have to deny that they're traumatized by it. They have to convince themselves, and we all do it for different things. You convince yourself that things don't matter. It's hard, really hard to accept. And I think particularly kind of in British society as well, we're not very good at grieving, not very good at talking about our emotions. It's kind of this stiff upper lip thing, isn't it, that we don't recognize this. Just keeping talking to her, taking the kind of line like, I'm so sorry you weren't supported, I'm so sorry that you couldn't, or maybe dropping in casually about, you can't really, casually is the wrong word, about how you felt, that you felt this, or you had a friend who felt that, or have they heard of, or suggest that if they're struggling in any way, that they talk to somebody. But I don't think that you can force it. I think the only thing we can really do is, again, tackle it in a kind of population, public level, in that keep talking about this as being a real thing. It is working. I'm saying, I think it was in some Facebook Live I did at some point over the last few months, it's all merged into one, that I've not got into a really big fight on the internet for ages. Nobody's yelled at me. It's at this point someone usually pops up and says, I'll yell at you.
Not on our watch, I promise.
I think people are listening. They're not taking it as the automatic criticism that we're saying that formula's evil, because we're not. We're not criticizing them. It's about the support. So I think we are moving forward compared to we were 2 years ago. If you say the words, I notice it all the time now. People talking about breastfeeding grief, just in social media conversations that you didn't used to see. And it's becoming more accepted. And if we keep going, if we just keep, I know, cheesy, keep sharing stuff on social media, and then, you know, like that, tag 6 friends and no more friends.
But it's true.
It just, the more we talk about something, the more it gets into everyday language, and the more we explain it, that it's about making sure that an individual woman is supported. Me saying I'm grieving because I couldn't breastfeed is not the same as saying I think you're a bad mother because you didn't. It's not about,
it's my feeling, it's personal to me. I'm not judging you.
It's not a judgment, but there's a wider societal issue that we have to tackle about women being held responsible for stuff and being made to feel guilty and being made to think that there are all these different camps of women who are criticizing them when that's not true. 1% of women breastfeed exclusively to 6 months in the UK. A handful percentage of women are breastfeeding at all by 12 months. So that means the vast majority of women in the UK use formula at some point. The vast majority of women mix feed across that, if you take the whole of the first year. So where are these camps of women who are sort of supposedly breast versus formula? They're just not there.
No.
The construct to pit women against each other rather than have to tackle stuff like this. Because if the government actually recognised that people were being let down and that they were ending up with psychological trauma and grief because of this, then they'd have to do something about it, theoretically. So it's not.
I think something that's important, for a message for breastfeeding support charities like our own to get through, is to go, actually, most breastfeeding counsellors and most peer supporting mums had a crap time at one time or another. They might not have deemed themselves as failures. They might not necessarily be as far as having experienced breastfeeding grief, although some will. But actually, that the experts aren't. You don't become an IBCLC or a BFC or a peer supporter because you found breastfeeding easy and think everyone should find it a doddle. And we do. One of my roles as a volunteer trustee is I'm the volunteer administrator for all the one-to-one virtual support requests, which we've been running now for 25, 26 weeks. So I've processed over 500 requests from mums for virtual support. And not quite to the extent of the 2,000 replies that you had with the long stories, but likewise, it's, you know, there's quite a few that come through of, I'm pregnant with my second, I had a disaster the first time, I don't suppose I'll be able to breastfeed this time, but I'm just wondering, is it possible there might be something I could do differently? And you're like, yeah, we can look after you. It wasn't you the first. And of course, I don't get into it because I'm not trained. So I put them in front of our breastfeeding counsellors who are trained to say the right thing. But of course, ultimately, the answer is going to be, yes, you can. It wasn't you the first time. It wasn't your fault. And I think we have to keep telling the story of breastfeeding grief to say to people, we're not being negative and undermining breastfeeding. We're saying, if you feel this way, that is legitimate, but it's not you. Your feelings are real, but equally your journey the next time could be different.
Yeah. And it's also one of the things that really stood out to me from this research that I didn't expect to see is that when women had that first baby and they couldn't breastfeed them, they felt all sorts of negative stuff, strong negative. They were grieving, they were angry. When they then had that second baby and they got the support they needed and they could breastfeed their baby, that's when it all fell apart. Because they suddenly realised that things could have been different and that they spent all that time blaming themselves and they realised they could have, and they really started properly grieving that initial feeding relationship.
I shall be forever cross with myself I didn't go to GBSN when I had the first. I will never stop that. And I'm sure there's going to be loads of women in the comments going, yeah, I will still always carry a little bit.
But at that, you know, there should have been more, all the health visitors in the area should have been saying, go to the group. You know, it's never your fault for not being able to see something and not knowing something exists, that it should be signposted to you. It really shocked me because I thought a second good breastfeeding experience would have been healing. But for some women it was. So some women it helped them. But then for others it's just kind of being aware of that and spotting the signs and getting the support you need then, even if your current breastfeeding relationship is going really, really well.
Yes, absolutely. Lindsay, by the way, is watching. So she's in the comments and she's put her email address up, and I think a few people have shared her page.
Good.
She said she had to dip in and out a bit because obviously evenings and children is not always a straightforward experience. Amy, I feel that we're at about an hour when we allow for if we deduct the half an hour of you and I screaming at our computers and my partner having to yell technical support that, bless him, didn't actually work, but we were trying our best. So I want to say a huge thank you from on behalf of GBSN and on behalf of the nearly 200 people who were watching. A huge thank you to you, not only for writing the amazing book, but for this fantastic talk and for taking these questions as well. I think that perhaps for those of us who know a mum or a mum to be about to start on her first journey, perhaps we ought to, instead of buying her shampoo and smellies for her baby shower, maybe we ought to get her your new book. Let's talk about the first year of surely you have a copy to hold up.
No, but it's reversed, so I can't see where I'm pointing.
There we are. Let's talk about the first year of parenting. I can see it.
Screen.
Just for the people who've been watching and commenting, probably in the few minutes after we finish this, not least because of all the blooming spam bots that were trying to get us, we will turn the comments off fairly shortly. But what we will do in due course, because GBSN is entirely run by volunteers, although we pay our breastfeeding counsellors, we will take the time to go back through the questions that have been raised, and at some point in the next few weeks we will try and do a consolidated post on Facebook answering some of those questions, either from our own breastfeeding counsellors and peer supporters, or if there's anything we feel we can trouble Amy for again, then we may drop a little email. Our first point today was Amy and I normally communicate through Instagram Messenger, and of course Instagram went down today, so that was a relaxing start to the whole situation. So I don't know about Amy, but I'm going to go and swap my water for gin, and just say a huge thank you to Amy, and to everybody as well who's donated. We'll put the donation links up again, but thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening. And if I have any clue how to turn this off, I shall do so shortly, but I imagine in the fine video tradition that we're all in coronavirus, I'm going to faff around now and then finally end the live. So thank you ever so much for joining us. Good night.